Thanks so much. Evening, everyone. As Mike said, my name's Rich Stacey Chapman. For those who don't know, I'm the events officer at British Canoeing. So myself and James, just going to kind of give a couple of brief updates. I'm going to start off with some COVID updates, and then James just some wider things that I think people are asking some questions on. So just go through it. In terms of kind of where we are with COVID, obviously, as I'm sure we all know, rules are kind of changing. Obviously, there was a big shift yesterday, and there's kind of, I guess, two different types of activity that it's useful to be kind of aware of, and it's kind of broken down within the regulations into kind of two areas. So you've got structured and organised. Which I kind of cover a bit more detail on that in a minute, but that's kind of formalized sporting activity, which has a separate set of rules. And then you've got kind of other activity outside of that. So thinking about obviously in a paddling, it might be paddling within a club environment would be formalized within the structured and organized. Other activity might be kind of paddling on your own recreationally or with some friends. So think about it kind of again, sort of the difference between in the first kind of lockdown when it was kind of first being talked about and things, the difference between playing in an organized football match is one set of rules compared to meeting up with 21 of your friends and playing football in the park. There would be two different things there because one is organized and structured and the other isn't. So non-structured and organized, the principle for that really is that if you're taking part in that non-structured sport or physical activity, you're basically doing that as a member of the public, and therefore the advice to the general public applies to you as well. So that will be kind of before the activity, during the activity, after the activity, throughout the whole process, whatever the guidance is for the general public, that would apply. So at the moment, so obviously previously in the last stage of the lockdown, it was very much about individual activity, with one person. That's what was allowed. Now we've got the rule of 6, so you could do that with a group of up to 6 people or 2 households. So that's the kind of things, and as that guidance on gathering sizes changes, that will also apply to kind of the non-structured sort of recreational sports. The one kind of difference probably at the moment is around travel. So travel, the indication, the requirement is to minimize travel. That's what the government guidance says, but it is permitted to travel for all kinds of physical activity. So you are allowed to do that for recreationally as well as through organized sport. The structured and organized, as it says here, and James is going to touch on a little bit more of this in his section, but activity that's run by a coach, a club, or a centre, and in order for it to fully fit that criteria, there has to be those plans in place around COVID. So a risk assessment and a management process as to how you're going to do. So as long as you're following the guidance, so obviously in a paddling world, as long as you're following the guidance that we set out as a governing body, and the guidance which is there from government, that the guidance kind of specifies what as the provider of activity, of organized activity, you have to do. As long as you follow that guidance, you're absolutely fine to do that. The wider advice for the public does, however, still apply for before and after activity. So whilst you're taking part in the activity, there are less restrictions. So things like gathering sizes don't apply while the actual act of the activity is happening. So while people are paddling, you can have a group of more than 6. That's absolutely fine. That's permitted within the guidance. But before and after the activity, that would still apply. So things like considering, if you're meeting up at venues, if you're doing things, if people are before they go on the water, if you're in a car park, if you're in an environment, that can't be a big group of 30 people there. They might be able to be a bigger group on the water once they're doing those things, but they can't be a big mass of people. Essentially for us, it's kind of on land. There can't be a big mass of people. So in terms of organisers, if you're organising an event or club activity or whatever that looks like, I guess the key things to do is firstly read the guidance. People have probably found that already on the British Canoeing website. If not, I'll put the link in the chat once we've finished. But look at that. Make an initial assessment as well is a key thing, I think, in terms of looking at that and saying, from the guidance that's in place, does that mean what I want to do, is that practical or not? So on a localized level, thankfully at the moment, that's likely to be positive. In some environments, that still might not be possible. If you're in a relatively small space, in terms of that congregation of people before and after, that might not be possible. But lots will be possible. But you might look at some of the guidance on accommodation, for example. If you're looking to travel further afield for activity, that might mean your activity isn't viable. But if it is viable, you could start to look at things, create a delivery plan as to what does that look like, how are you going to mitigate the risks, and then you got the risk assessment there, creation of that, following it through, and appointing a COVID officer to kind of have that, oversee that process and do those things. So it's really just throughout the organising process. What I would say is that most things that you'll kind of organize will be slight. I mean, it's the same as day-to-day life. Things are slightly more complicated because of the COVID factors to be considered. Now we all leave the house, we have masks to consider, we have sanitizer to consider. Everything is a little bit more complicated than maybe it was 18 months ago. And that's kind of the same with organizing activity. But if you kind of get into the swing of it and get your head around what you need to do, it will become kind of a little bit more straightforward. So just in terms of where we are right now, as of yesterday, we've got that rule of sixes in place, or 2 households, which can be more than 6. And as I said, for informal activity, that's all of the time. That applies. So if you're going out paddling and it's not in an organised and structured activity, your 6 is your maximum number. If it is organised, you can have more people paddling together, but you do need to observe that before and after. Outdoor team sport is permitted, but that has to follow the specific guidance. So from a paddling perspective, canoe polo, rafting, we have some specific guidance for them, and that's around kind of mitigating the risks within the activity itself. So it's considering those things. So there's some slight adaptations to the games themselves. Outdoor facilities can reopen, but they have to be able to observe gathering sizes. So again, that's the stuff around the land around the water for us, do that kind of stuff. Can facilities cope with the amount of people to facilitate the activity? As long as that happens, that's fine. But no change rooms or showers are allowed, apart from for catering for people with disability, or things like showers. For in an emergency situation, if somebody's capsized and is on a freezing cold day, needs a shower, then clearly that's allowed, but that shouldn't be the norm. Spectators aren't permitted. There are a few kind of exceptions to that, but it really is about minimizing that. So with under 18s, if some people need to be there from a safeguarding perspective, that's allowed. But I think even within kind of, as a general rule, parents spectating even isn't permitted. So that's something to kind of consider, that's just throughout the process. Talked about travel already. It's minimized, but it is allowed. In terms of wider activity, a key factor for distances will be that no accommodations available. So again, that kind of necessitates that stay local element. And there's a requirement on everybody, and this kind of runs throughout, really, just of a self-assessment of symptoms before taking part in any activity, before leaving the house, which is, again, I guess what hopefully everybody is doing all of the time. If you have the symptoms of COVID, you should be getting checked, doing those things and following those rules. But particularly for around the activity, that's a specific piece of guidance. In terms of the next steps, obviously it all aligns very much to the government roadmap, which we've all seen about. I guess the challenge that we have, and therefore that I guess you have, is that the detailed guidance is only tends to be released a few days. I mean, ambitiously, they're kind of talking about a week potentially, but so far what we've seen is it's a few days before the next step of the guidance. So I think the reason for that being, as we all know, the guidance can come through. The government will announce 2 weeks before the next steps of the roadmap whether that's going to go ahead. Potentially some tweaks to that could be made once that's confirmed that that's going ahead, that then rolls out to government departments. So it comes out to Department for Culture, Media and Sport. They then assess what that means for sport and for physical activity. They then set their guidance. They put that in place. They put that out to us. And we then interpret that and kind of summarize that where we need to, and get that out and update our guidance in British canoeing. So it's a challenge. We as it stands at the moment, we have the headlines from the roadmap, and DCMS and Sport England have made some initial assessments of those things and what that means for sport. And I think we're in a relatively fortunate position that a lot of our activity can happen from this stage because we're an outdoor sport and those kind of areas. But we have to be aware that some of those things may well change as we go through, and can unfortunately change right up until pretty close. So I think the next steps of the roadmap can be kind of obviously delayed. I think in theory that's 2 weeks out from the next steps. They'll be announced and changes to timelines will be then. But if they needed to be changed at a later date, I still suspect that could still happen. So that's the kind of caveats to the stuff on the next slides. But just to give a bit of background. But the next step, which is hopefully going to come into place on the 12th of April and not before the 12th of April, that means indoor facilities can be reopened just for individual activity or for households. Indoor sport can take place for under 18s, and self-contained accommodation. So again, if you're looking at trips or tours, those kind of things, that might be a useful thing. But the self-contained accommodation is pretty strict. So that's everyone's going to have their own facilities, so no shared toilet usage, that kind of thing. So it's very much kind of fully self-contained accommodation or kind of private accommodation. So kind of holiday homes, that kind of thing, caravans, that kind of thing is permitted. The next step, hopefully, will be the 17th of May. Again, subject to change, but at that point, the rule of 6 becomes 30. So again, for organised sport, in terms of the activity itself, that doesn't make a difference because that's exempt. It does make a difference for that before and after activity. So just in terms of the numbers of people that can be around, it clearly makes a difference. And then for informal kind of recreational activity that's kind of out there for groups of people operating on their own, that will apply obviously all the time. So a bigger group of friends ultimately could kind of go out paddling once we get into that step 3. And then a wider ranges of indoor activity can resume. Wider accommodation like hotels will be open, and spectators permitted up to kind of limits. I think for the majority of activities that we operate, the sizes of the kind of spectator limits will be ample for the kind of things that we're looking to operate with, obviously. But all of that will clearly be subject to the kind of gathering elements. And clearly, if you're operating in a smaller venue and there's only a capacity for X number, you have to kind of be mindful of that and make sure social distancing is in place. And then hopefully the final step of the roadmap, again, not before the 21st of June, but then at that point, there'll be no gathering limits. All activity pretty much can take place, and hopefully getting back to some sense of normality. I think obviously we don't know exactly what that looks like yet, in terms of the areas of in terms of whether things like social distancing might remain a feature, whether some of the mitigations that we have in place, whether they might continue, but hopefully there'll be some kind of greater sense of normality by the time we get to that stage. In terms of then our guidance, just to kind of touch on that, the guidance I kind of referenced, it's got all of these different sections, so hopefully fairly helpful to be able to work through this. It tries to kind of summarize, I guess, all of the key areas of the government guidance. I think there's no real way of dressing it up. As I said earlier, that things are a bit more complicated with COVID, and things will require a bit more thought. There's not necessarily I kind of wish I could kind of come and do 10-15 minutes and chat through all of these things and answer all the questions. It's not quite that straightforward, unfortunately, but within these sections, it covers a lot of the kind of things, and through some of the guidance documents, through some of the templates, it just gives you some things to consider and work through, you can start to kind of get some ideas as to what that might look like and how you might be able to organize your activity. I think that's kind of it from me in terms of those things. I don't know if anyone wants to take any questions at this point, or if we just hand it over to James, but anyone got any kind of immediate questions on that?
Yes, please.
Okay, Steve.
Just your first slide concerning obviously the release yesterday, you refer to changing rooms, but it does state quite specifically within the guidance that although changing rooms are shut, toilets can be opened.
Yes, sorry, yes. Yeah, toilets are permitted, yeah.
Okay, that's great. I didn't want to make sure that we were at cross swords or something.
Yeah, no, sorry, yeah.
Anybody else?
I have a question. Sorry, I have a question about travel. Is there still restrictions in place for visiting other home countries? Wales, Scotland.
Yes. So I should have said that this guidance is specifically based on England. So that's the kind of thing there. I think yes, there will be. I think that will then kind of fall down to what the guidance are there. And I think the general rule will be for this is it's kind of that. As far as I'm aware, in the other home nations, it will fall to the guidance of the general public. So as and when people are allowed to travel into Wales, for example, people will be allowed to travel into Wales to paddle, will be my understanding. But I can, while James is talking, I can have a quick scan of that, see if I can dig that out.
Rich?
Yep.
I've put the links to the Welsh guidance and the Scots guidance already in the chat as you were talking.
Perfect, thank you.
So what the Welsh are saying is, because they've covered it specifically, so as of the 27th, stay local has been lifted. If you live in Wales, you are now allowed to travel anywhere throughout Wales to go paddling. However, if you're in England or Scotland, you're not yet allowed to enter Wales to paddle unless you have a reasonable excuse. Now, what that reasonable excuse will be isn't a question that either Rich or I can answer, I'm afraid.
Well, you see, my area is I'm travelling to Scotland, and I've had a letter from the Scottish government today that because we're an international country, they're not allowing us to enter at least before the 17th of May, and maybe that sometime after.
Quite possibly. And so I think I've been at my desk all day today on various meetings, but I think I saw a news flash come through earlier this morning that there's been a change in the guidance today in Scotland. So all of these things are pretty fluid, and all I can advise is that you're going to need to check what they're actually saying on the day of travel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because that's why my question came about, was with Scottish government, was in their timeline there was no mention of travel between England and Scotland at all right through to June, and I was hoping to do a trip in May, and that's why I asked the question of the Scottish government about that one. But as you rightly said, somebody else has said to me that Nicola Sturgeon stood up and made some other comments today, which I'm still trying to track down. Be interested in what happens.
I'm fairly sure, Rich, that I saw it on the BBC website. So if you've got 2 seconds while I'm boring people, then that would be a good place to start looking for.
I'll look on that as well.
Yeah, I'll have a dig.
Malcolm has raised his hand. So if you unmute yourself and ask your question.
Will do, thank you. Question is just in relation to the guidelines around the 17th and indoor activity taking place for the wider than more than just children. Does that include, do you know if that includes pool sessions?
Yes, I believe. Yes, I believe it would do.
Okay, and then that rule of 30, does that also?
So Malcolm, sorry, before you go on to the next bit, just stick with pools.
Go for it.
So what we discovered after the last lockdown and helping clubs through it, or all of the last lockdowns, was that just because the guidance says they can open doesn't mean that pools can open or will open. And it also doesn't mean that necessarily they're going to open as they did before. So the guidance will still exist around the 3 square meter rule that they had last summer. And the guidance will still exist around how their access to the poolside may operate. And so the key information there is to make sure that you go and, as it becomes closer, you start talking to the pool operator and having your risk assessment with our backing to go in and say, well, this is what we believe and this is the process and this is how we think canoeing can operate in your pool. Because it's easy for them to deliver swimming because there's national rules around that.
Yep.
But it's much harder for them to deliver paddling.
Okay. And I think the other thing just to say on that as well is, so I've completely lost my train of thought there. It'll come back to me. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, the one thing is it's not a public used pool at the moment, and it's been used for like local swimming clubs. So they're keen to do stuff with us, but I think we just want to make sure that we're doing things by the book and we're not jumping the gun, because they kind of went, oh yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you in April. And it's like, oh, it's not viable for us to do it in April because if it's only kids, whereas adults as well is probably more, more adult centric club. So
yeah, sorry, that's what I was going to say is that as well. The other thing will be is that they probably won't know, and we don't know yet, as I said, the details for that stage of the guidance.
Yeah,
so for example, like the 29th, it was quite late in the day. It was certainly less than a fortnight, but maybe about 10 days beforehand, that we got any kind of steer from government about what the travel implications might be for paddling. So that element obviously for us and for paddling was quite key. Clearly, if people were told that they had to essentially stay very local and weren't allowed to travel for paddling, that would make quite a big difference to our guidance, and certainly for activity or events or those kind of things to happen. So again, some of those specifics, that exactly what that means, we might not know that until a week or 2 weeks out for that, which then means that once that kind of specifics of exactly what the restrictions are for them and how they have to operate, once they know those things, then it'll be easier for them to plan exactly what is allowed and what isn't allowed.
Sure thing. All right, I'll keep my ear to the ground and wait and see what they come back with. But thank you, gents. That's pretty helpful.
Did you have another one as well?
Chris Wild.
No.
Sorry. Chris Wild has raised his hand. If you ask.
Yeah, hiya. You may not know the answer to this one, but we're kind of at a point where we need to try and plan and work out exactly what we're doing. We're due to run a club slalom, well, a national slalom, which is the Div 3-4 race, and at the minute it says that we can run it under the slalom committee's bit, saying that we can run it as for local paddlers or something like this is the phrase. You haven't got any ideas what that will mean at that point. It's the 25th, 26th of May, so it's after that bit, and they're sort of the only query we've got is like, you can go ahead with the race, and it says sort of should be for local paddlers. Have you got any ideas? Does that mean sort of paddlers from the southwest or what, or it might be something that you haven't got an answer to yet?
Yeah, I think in terms of that guidance that came out from Slalom, I think it was probably a little bit before some of the kind of greater clarification from government in terms of what that meant. I think, as I say, clearly now people can travel within England. People can travel for activity. I think, when did you say it was? Sorry, was it May?
It's literally, yeah. So it's actually the first weekend that's on the calendar. It is that 24th, 25th, 26th. So I think the regs are due, if it all goes to plan, to change on the 17th, aren't they? So it's like the first weekend after that.
Yeah. So So in theory, if the roadmap goes to plan, then I think people will kind of, from an England perspective, people will be able to travel and accommodation will be open, and very much, people will be kind of getting back to some kind of normality. I think some of it from the Slalom committee is probably caution in terms of not wanting to, I think it's something we're kind of conscious of Century as well, kind of is organizing things and attracting lots of people from all over the country to come to events, and kind of the perception of that in local communities, if you like. So being mindful of that, I think within Slalom, within divisional racing in particular, I think there's obviously a greater consideration of the other home nations elements. So clearly, within kind of Scotland and Wales and things, and that travel between them, that's at the minute, as people have already alluded to, that's more of a challenge. So it may well be that people from outside of England couldn't or shouldn't travel to the event. So that potentially would be I guess a red line. Other than that, it's probably just I think it is probably open to interpretation. And it's probably just I guess it's from your perspective, sort of managing numbers in kind of not how many can you cope with, what does that look like, keep on top of that, and then I know this is much easier said than done, but kind of working out in sort of circles, kind of if you've got lots of people that can fill it from your club and clubs in a very close area, probably go ahead with that. If you need to widen that to wider audiences, then in reality within the guidance, there's no reason not to do that ultimately. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, it does sort of. It's about where I thought it'd probably be. Yeah, I mean, it'll be, really nice to see some return to it. So
yeah, and it's just the other thing I'd say is it's just about being slightly cautious about that element of it being that first weekend afterwards. Yeah, obviously
by the how it's perceived by the local community as well. So yeah, we have to make a decision.
And it's worth thinking through at this stage, Chris, what accommodation might be like, because if you're talking about people travelling, obviously, as of the 17th of May, I think, looking at the sheet, residential businesses will be able to open, but that doesn't mean to say that they will be open. So having a conversation, if the majority of your competitors come and camp, can you talk and reserve spaces or kind of pencil in spaces so that they can have a site on the campsite for themselves or whatever? You may be able to make some of this easier for your competitors, is what I'm trying to say, I guess.
And then also just what does that, if for example that it's the camping and they're camping in shared facilities, and 2 weeks out from the event the government announces that actually that accommodation can't open that date after all, and therefore all of those people have to pull out, is that still a viable event?
Well, I think, from my point of view, and I'm not actually a current committee member of stuff, but I just run a lot of the slalom activity and I'm keen to see it go ahead. But from my point of view, part of the definition of it being local paddlers would make me think, well, we don't need to offer, normally we'd offer camping on site. And actually, as part of it, we'd perhaps say, no, there won't be any camping on site because you're meant to be local, so you can travel for each day, which mitigates quite a lot of that. And so that's just my thoughts on the camping side of it, was that while it's lovely, it's absolutely great and it's buzzing when you can do it, I think we could quite happily just say, no, we're not camping on site. There might be a couple of us have to stay down there to look after the course and the kit and whatever. But by the fact that it should be local paddlers, it's not unreasonable that they should be travelling, an hour maximum maybe to get there. So there's not really necessarily a need to stay overnight, in my opinion. So.
And I guess from my point of view, Rich may well say something slightly different, but those are the kind of choices that you're able to make this far out. I know that my club is looking to run a reasonably sized race. We usually draw 200, 250 entrants. We're not going to be running it in the local park where we normally run it because the council's asking for us to treat it as an event that might draw 10,000 people into a park, and we just can't cope with that level of risk assessment. And also they're asking for an investment of, we've got to pay for planning permission now for something that may or may not happen in June, July. So we're going to move to a closed venue, and we are scheduling what we think we can deliver to deliver the best event possible, but probably to a limited number because that's how many the venue we're going to choose can cope with. And so we will shape the event around our needs rather than the regulation. We have to abide by the regulations, but it's our needs for the event that will shape how that works, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And I think it would be a kind of advice for your event and actually for events in general and for activity in general is if you want to or need to create an element of certainty or a greater element of certainty, I would err on the side of caution. If you're planning your events around kind of best case scenario and that the roadmap kind of follows exactly as planned and to the dates, you clearly, certainly if you're running close to some of those deadlines, you run the risk of then being disappointed and having to change things. And for some events, that might be absolutely fine because that's the best way of doing it. And it might be, if it's local people and it changes, that might not make too much difference. But if it's kind of bigger events and there's greater cost implications, for example, or some of those things that James mentioned, the easiest way of doing it is to kind of plan for, yes, okay, this is what we can do. And you can create certainty for yourself and your own event by saying, yes, that's in theory what might be possible. But realistically, so we've got an event we're involved in organising centrally for the sprint and paracanoe selection events. In theory, competitors will be able to stay in the area in self-contained accommodation from the 12th of April for our event that's 5 days later. If that had changed and that wasn't possible, that would have been a massive issue and meant the event couldn't go ahead, and we needed it to go ahead. So we're operating under a different elite exemption. So we've kind of erred on the side of caution to give ourselves the best chance of it going ahead, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I'll hand over to James then.
If that's it for questions, Mark, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Nobody. So go.
Okay, fantastic. So there were two things that I've just slotted into the next few slides, and I'll have to prompt Rich to push them on for me when we're ready. But I was quite aware that Mark Jan put in some of the things around opportunity into the title, so that's presumably what some of you have come to hear about. And then some of the stuff that Rich was talking about was around club activity. And for those of you that are involved in clubs, the definitions and things like that around club activity have changed over the last 12 months. And therefore, we've done more thinking and more process around them. So I thought I'd just lay some of that out for you. So if Rich flicks me onto the first slide, hopefully it's quite colourful. Oh, you're working to a different presentation to me, Rich. Just stop the presentation and I'll flip mine up. Cool. Here we go then, let's do it this way. Hopefully you can see that, which is the same but different. Yes, no? Fantastic. So this is Sport England's advice about coming back after COVID, and specifically clubs coming back after COVID, things to think in mind. And I'll talk you through them because the writing isn't great on colours, but effectively the first green block is talking about emphasise the enjoyment factor. Now, this is something that we know from years and years and years through kind of research into coaching and other activity, that people are interested in having fun. But even more so now, we need to make sure that we're talking about our activity is fun, and that's why they want to be involved in it. Okay. The red block is talking about easing people back in. So encouraging small, manageable changes to strength, stamina, and confidence. I ran a webinar last night for clubs around building membership over the coming period. And I was trying to outline to them how much our bodies have probably changed over the last year. So even for myself, I'm still running or paddling 5 or 6 times a week. But yesterday, cycling 20K for an eye checkup was more than my body could cope with. And that's because, although I'm still actively training for short periods, my step count during the day has dropped from 8,000 to 9,000 pre-COVID to probably 1,000 to 2,000 at the moment. So if you think about how you're planning activity and what you're going to do, there will be a period as people start coming back, particularly people you don't know quite so well, of starting small and building scale up. And again, that ties directly to that enjoyment bit, that fun factor, because if you're asking people to operate beyond their comfort level, it ceases to be fun very quickly. And on that red block, there was a marked increase in heart attacks after lockdowns 1 and 2 as activity came back. So I would be encouraging you to, again, start small and build up as you ease people back in. The third one is keep it cheap or free. So it's a lot around how people's incomes have changed over the last year. And Sport England had some pretty big stats. Around 60% of the population are less well off than they were a year ago. Therefore, kind of being able to offer something to make the into your club an opportunity would be a really worthwhile thought process. I know that we got asked probably a month ago now, to write a template club hardship fund. So if you're interested in that, that's on the Clubhouse in the governance section. Rich has just taken you through all of the guidance and the plans and the process around operating events. And I guess advertising your club is exactly the same. So the blue is talking about showcasing your safety measures and thinking about how clear you can make it to your potential members or potential customers or your potential paddling partners about how you're making their experience safe, both safe physically and safe for the virus. And they talk about you putting in number limits, making sure of social distancing and cleaning and signage. And when I talk to clubs about how they're going to operate the bits that Rich was talking about earlier, between 6 before the session, their safety number on the session, and then 6 after the session, actually that creates a load of headaches for clubs about how they access the water and how they get off and how people are meeting in the car park and when's chatting and when does club activity start and when's a managed environment and all of those kind of things. So a lot of clubs did a really good job last summer, but this is the opportunity just to shout about the good job that you do. And the final one there, I know that Mark Jan's probably talked to you many times about, is the mental health matters bit. So Sport England are talking about showing the benefits and encouraging people to be kind themselves, but also to celebrate those small daily victories. And sneaking off to get my packet of crisps before we started here was my small victory for the day. In terms of other support, as your club comes back, and he says, just looking for the control panel, as your club comes back or organisations come back, there is a load of toolkits out there to help you do bits, pieces, stuff. So when I'm able, I'll drop the link for this one into the chat. But this is quite a large PDF style document that has several kind of templates for forms to fill out, to think about how are our volunteers coming back? Have we consulted with them around their personal risk level, what the risk they're wanting to take on, how they want to engage with the other people around them, how they feel about the club, before we even start about looking at just members in the club. So yeah, that's there. And a lot of clubs have found that quite a useful document. And then the third slide in this kind of bit is this one. Now, this came from a piece of research that Martin Chester did last year. So Martin used to be head of Plaisie Brennan once upon a time. And he's done a piece of research that updates the Getting Active Outdoors research for 2020 for COVID. And although it's based around campsites, so some of it isn't necessarily directly relevant to us, there are some key thoughts in here. And they echo some of those Sport England thoughts that we saw with the boxes earlier. So there's a picture down on the bottom right that talks about pitching everything at the right level. And when you choose as an experienced person the right level, you need to drop that 2, 3, 4 levels below where you think is the right level or where you may have run it pre-COVID. And that's partly because we know from British Canoeing membership data that British Canoeing has doubled in size over the last year, but also that the people that are participating are not the normal people who would have participated the previous year. So there's a completely different group of people taking part in our sport who may have a different set of worries and a different set of concerns and a different set of barriers that we probably need to help them past. On the bottom left, it talks about a positive experience and trying to make sure that, although they talk about this, the customer journey, we might phrase it as the member journey, or we might talk about it as making my mates happy, but making sure that the kind of the positive experience flows right the way through. And then the middle right is talking about clarity and explicit articulation. So there's some long words that I'm never ever going to be able to spell there, but clarity and explicit articulation of the benefits and incentives and the key to motivation. And what that's really around is just when you've got somebody to go paddle with, to talk to them all the time before you arrive. Make sure they understand what you're expecting from them and they're expecting from you all through the preparation, the delivery and the post of the session, the after the session. I just thought that some of Martin's research was actually spot on for this kind of coming back in to activity in the world at the moment. So stick with those. I think I saw a couple of questions flash into the chat, Mark. Were they questions or were they just comments that James is talking rubbish?
No questions, except I think Paul Carroll has now a question. Is there a breakdown of BC members by gender and age bracket available to aid in our marketing?
Not yet, Paul, but I'm just about to push go on a webinar in May where Jenny Spencer will sit down with us and take us through some of the membership research that we've done. So that will be available to book hopefully next week from the booking process.
Thank you very much, James. That's great. Thank you.
And that PDF file of Sport England, are you mailing that, or can you put it on Facebook? Or
I'll drop that into the chat here in a moment. For some reason, it won't let me access the chat, so I'll do that as soon as I stop jabbering on at you.
Okay, so far no questions, James. Thank you.
Excellent. So this is generic stuff now that we're going to talk through, but I think again, it does help to make sense in some of the things that Rich was talking about being specific about what you're doing. And again, I'm the club support manager, so I can only really talk about clubs in that sense, our guidance and how it works for clubs. What you can see in the blue box is our definition of club activity. Now, this was consulted on pretty widely in 2019. We visited 40 clubs face to face, and then there were 2 rounds of electronic consultation on this. But effectively, we define club activity, and a club may be, or the club is, the Open Canoe Association just as much as it's Paul at Bath, or some of the other guys that I know as they pop up in their photos. But we define activity for them as any activity that has been assessed as part of the club's safety framework and promoted on the club calendar, website or notice board. So effectively, what it's talking about is the club committee has to know what's going on, has to have risk assessed it, and has to promoted it to the membership. Okay, that's the fundamentals that we're looking for. It also goes on to talk about how clubs can come together. And the reason that this is important is because I'm expecting everybody on this call is a full British Canoeing on the Water member, and therefore they're insured for all of their activity. But it's quite apparent from those 40 visits we did to clubs in 2019 that clubs don't really explain to their members that club associate members, so those that are members of a club but not full British Canoeing members, are not insured for any activity other than club activity. And so what we've attempted to do in the triangle is define what is club activity. And that's along the top line. The words in grey are all where we would expect club activity to be. So orchestrated club activity would be led by somebody that the club has said is an appropriate leader. Supervised would be somebody's unlocking the club, checking that the club risk assessments, operating procedures are being complied to, and fundamentally counting them out and counting them back. And then collaborative club activity is where the club has probably specified a time, a set of operating procedures, and a competence from the paddlers. And then the the paddlers can self-lead within that environment that the club has set up, okay? But it all sits within the club, committee, knowing that it's going to go ahead, risk assessing it and promoting it. Anything else probably isn't club activity at this point. Okay, now not all clubs will do all three of those boxes of club activity, and some will have a lot that sit in the blue that they feel they're responsible for, but actually isn't insured. And those are the kind of questions that we're starting to discuss with clubs as they go further on through the process. This is, the next slide sits somewhere between Rich and I in terms of responsibility. And effectively, this is about signing off activity. So an individual member can go and do whatever an individual member wants to do. But as soon as you're in a club, the club has a duty of care and a responsibility to all its members for the activity it's providing. And therefore, the club definition activity, the triangle, exists, okay? But once you get towards an event, and although this is detailed discipline committees and it also includes RDTs, the club definition of activity no longer applies. So clubs can sign events off, discipline committees and RDTs can sign events off, but they're not interchangeable. There is always somebody responsible for the activity. And I'm not sure that, again, in the conversations we've had with clubs, that clubs have necessarily understood that, because that changes how their club associates might access some of these events, and particularly if they're self-organising those events. We have changed the rules for those of you of a kind of competitive nature this year, but it also affects not environmental, but it also affects RDT type participation events. So in the past, only junior members of clubs with a registered junior section could access low-level competitions and events, whereas going forwards later in the year, that will be all club associate members. Okay. And just to kind of top it off, this is the benefits of club associate members and also the non-benefits, if that's a good way of phrasing it. So club associate members are insured for paddling within their clubs and their club only's club activity framework. They can coach and lead as deployed by the club. They don't have to be qualified, because we know that clubs can deploy suitable people to deliver the right activity. They are insured for leading trips and journeys, which are designated club activity. And they are insured to take part in designated entry-level competitions and events. What's not included, though, is the boat licence, because the club can purchase club licences for club activity, but that's separate. And insurance cover for paddling outside of club activity and coaching and leading outside of club activity. So as you can see, it's probably quite important that club associates know what they can and can't do and how to support each other and how the club is supporting them around that. So in terms of where that sits or where to get more help on that, first stop shop, all clubs have access to the clubhouse. If you're unsure, let me know and we'll work it out together. Otherwise, mine, Russ and Phil's phone numbers are on the screen there. We're now trying to run nationally. So a lot of you are Southwest based, I think, looking at the names on the screen. I traditionally would have been your development officer, but if you fancy talking to Phil or Russ rather than me, now the opportunity is there rather than being bored at by my gentle tones. And then Craig and David are there to help us as kind of the fountains of all IT type knowledge in the office, how affiliation works, process, how Go paddling works and those kind of things. But hopefully most of the information's on the clubhouse. I guess part of what I'd like to say at that point is that you'll see a migration over the next few months of anything to do with clubs from the British Canoeing website into the clubhouse, because that's what the clubs asked us to do back in the consultation in 2019. So you will see less information available on the main British Canoeing website going forwards. So quite happy to take any questions around that. I don't know if Mark Jan's got any that have come in on the chat up until now or comments, but I'll see where we get to from there.
I didn't see any questions.
Yes.
So that's good. Anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Otherwise, I would say thank you very much. If you want to go home, you're allowed to go home. But if you want to stay on a little bit longer, I'll leave it on for a while and we can have a little chat. I will stop the recording if there's no questions anymore.